Sergeant Jack Carter had seen bad days before, getting chewed out by a drill sergeant, a lost bet that left him with a tattoo of a grinning cartoon cat on his shoulder, and the time he accidentally called his commanding officer Mom over the radio. But none of those compared to this. He lay sprawled in the dirt of a nameless, God-forsaken planet, his armor cracked, his rifle empty, and his leg leaking something vital. Around him, the battlefield smoldered. Charred alien carcasses and human soldiers alike littered the ground in a grim mosaic of war. Overhead, the sky was an angry shade of orange, streaked with smoke trails from burning dropships. Humanity's push into Dominion territory had been ambitious, and as it turned out, utterly suicidal. Carter gritted his teeth and propped himself against the husk of a downed troop carrier. His radio crackled, but all that came through was static. That wasn't good. Either command was jammed, or worse, no one was left to talk back. He glanced at his leg. Definitely broken. Maybe punctured. Probably not great. But he wasn't dead yet, which was more than he could say for the poor bastard whose helmet was rolling past him in the wind. A guttural chittering noise made him freeze. He turned his head, slowly because whiplash was the last thing he needed, and saw them. Krall warriors. 6 of them, striding across the battlefield like they owned the place, which, to be fair, they kind of did now. 8 feet tall, exoskeletal with too many joints bending in too many wrong directions, they looked like what would happen if a praying mantis hit the gym. Their armor gleamed in the firelight, a slick, unnatural blue. One of them carried a plasma spear still dripping with something unpleasant. Carter's first instinct was to play dead. His second instinct was to shoot them. His third instinct, which overruled the other 2, was to groan, because his leg decided now was the perfect time to remind him it was very, very broken. The Krall heard him. One of them barked something in its native tongue, like gravel being ground between metal plates, and the others turned, their mandibles clicking in amusement. Then they started laughing. Carter blinked. That was new. Usually, alien death squads didn't pause for comedy night. One of them, who had extra spikes on its shoulders, which Carter decided meant it was in charge, sauntered over and nudged him with the butt of its spear. Weak, it said in heavily accented English, dragging the word out like it enjoyed the taste of it. Human. Broken. Carter, despite everything, smirked. Yeah, well, you should see the other guys. He motioned vaguely to the corpses. More chittering laughter. Another soldier crouched next to him, prodding his ribs like he was some exotic pet. So fragile. Spiky Shoulders tilted its head, then activated a wrist device. A hologram flickered to life, displaying a live broadcast back to their command. Carter saw a row of seated Dominion officers, various alien species, all looking smug and bored. This, Spiky Shoulders announced, gesturing to Carter like a showman unveiling a disappointing magic trick, is the best of the human warriors. Carter would have been insulted, but honestly, he was too tired to argue. Another Krall, clearly inspired by the moment, leaned in and flicked Carter's helmet off. It clattered away, exposing his sweat-matted hair. Ugh, one of them hissed. Soft, small head. Carter rolled his eyes. Yeah, well, your mom liked it. Silence. Then, one of the Krall made a strangled noise, a surprised snort, almost like a hiccup. Carter squinted. Was that amusement? Spiky Shoulders recovered first, though its mandibles twitched in what Carter swore was a suppressed grin. You are nothing, it said, more for the benefit of its audience than Carter. You fight. You lose. You die. Carter shrugged. Pretty much, yeah. Spiky Shoulders leaned closer, its compound eyes reflecting the firelight. Any last words, human? Carter thought about it. He had a million things he could say. A witty comeback, an insult about their fashion sense, maybe even something profound about the resilience of the human spirit. Instead, he grinned through bloodied teeth and said, yeah, you should have finished the job. Spiky Shoulders chittered in amusement, then straightened, waving a dismissive claw. Leave it. It will die slow. And just like that, they walked away, laughing. Carter lay there, staring at the alien sky, listening to the sound of their retreating footsteps. He exhaled through his nose, then chuckled, low and dry. They really should have finished the job. Jack Carter had been left for dead before. Once, back on Earth, his squad abandoned him in the middle of a training exercise because he had made the critical mistake of saying, "I bet I could take a nap and still finish faster than you guys." Turn out he could not. But that was different. That had been in a controlled environment with no actual stakes. This was a whole new level of screwed. His leg was still a disaster zone, his rifle was empty, and somewhere in the distance, the Krall were probably still laughing about how pathetic humans were. Which was fine. Let them laugh. He had work to do. First, he had to not die. He dragged himself toward cover, every inch a fresh dose of agony. His body protested, but he ignored it. Pain meant he was still alive. He reached a rocky outcrop and pressed himself into the shadows, out of sight. His hands worked on autopilot, pulling out the emergency med gel from his vest and slathering it over his wound. The stuff smelled like burnt plastic and regret, but it numbed the pain and stopped the bleeding, so he'd take it. Next problem, weapons. His rifle was useless, but the Krall had been kind enough to leave him with some party favors. A few discarded plasma cartridges lay nearby, probably dropped by soldiers too busy laughing at him to notice. He pocketed them. A little further out, one of the corpses had a Krall plasma pistol still holstered. He crawled over, pried it free, and gave it a once-over. The weapon was crude, built for oversized claws, not human hands, but it would do. Now, revenge. The Krall weren't expecting anything. They thought he was dead, or as good as. That meant they wouldn't be watching their backs. Carter had no squad, no support, and barely any functioning limbs, but what he did have was spite, and that was often more than enough. He moved like a ghost, sticking to the shadows, keeping low. The Krall had set up a temporary outpost in the wreckage of a downed human dropship. Big mistake. Carter knew how those ships worked. More importantly, he knew how to make them stop working. He reached the perimeter, staying just outside the floodlights. Two Kralls stood guard, chatting in their guttural clicks. Carter took a deep breath, then chucked a rock behind them. It wasn't a sophisticated plan, but hey, neither were they. One turned. The other scoffed, said something that probably translated to, "You're imagining things," then immediately got a plasma bolt to the skull. The first Krall barely had time to react before Carter tackled it, jamming his stolen pistol under its chin and pulling the trigger. The body went limp, and he lowered it gently to the ground. Stealth was officially over. He grabbed the dead Krall's plasma rifle, much better than the pistol, and sprinted toward the ship. The Krall inside were already shouting, scrambling for weapons. Carter didn't give them the chance. He fired in short, controlled bursts, taking out two before they could react. Another lunged at him with a blade, but Carter sidestepped and smashed the butt of his rifle into its head. The last Krall tried to retreat, which Carter found personally offensive. He shot it in the back before it could make it 2 steps. With the outpost cleared, he turned his attention to the dropship. He pried open the maintenance panel, fingers moving with muscle memory. It was almost nostalgic, really, if he ignored the blood and the screaming. The trick with these ships was that they had emergency fuel lines running along the undercarriage. Punch a hole in the right spot, light it up, and the whole thing went up like a 4th of July barbecue gone wrong. Carter rigged a makeshift fuse using a plasma cartridge and some scrap wiring, set the timer for 20 seconds, then booked it. Behind him, the explosion rocked the battlefield, sending fire and debris skyward. Carter grinned. That would get their attention. And it did. Within minutes, the Krall were scrambling. Their patrols doubled. Their movements became frantic. They had no idea what was happening, which was perfect, because neither did Carter. He was making it up as he went. Over the next few hours, he became a one-man nightmare. He stole weapons from fallen enemies, set up crude traps, and picked them off one by one. They were bigger, stronger, and had better tech, but they weren't trained for this kind of warfare. They expected direct combat, not a single wounded soldier, systematically dismantling them. By the time the second explosion went off, this time at their ammo depot, the laughter had stopped. Carter crouched on a ridge, watching the chaos unfold. The Krall were panicking. Good. Let them. They deserved a taste of their own fear. His body was running on fumes, but he wasn't done yet. He spotted the Krall officer from before, spiky shoulders, barking orders, mandibles clicking rapidly. Carter smirked. Oh yeah, this was far from over. Jack Carter had been called a lot of things in his life, stubborn, reckless, a bad influence, and once, by an ex-girlfriend, a human disaster with good arms. But he had never been called a myth before. That, however, was exactly what was happening. The Krall were afraid. He could see it in the way they moved, their usual arrogant strut replaced with frantic, darting glances. They whispered in their guttural tongue, checking shadows, flinching at every sound. The mighty warriors of the Dominion, reduced to a pack of nervous insects waiting for the boot to drop. Carter grinned and made sure he was the boot. Spiky Shoulders, the Krall officer who had laughed at him, was losing control. The Krall were supposed to be predators, not prey, and they didn't know how to handle the shift in roles. Every few minutes, another explosion rattled their camp. Another soldier failed to report in. They had started setting up floodlights, but Carter had a plasma rifle and a nasty sense of humor, so those didn't last long. He watched from a ruined structure, his stolen rifle propped against his knee. His leg was still a mess, but adrenaline and spite had carried him this far. The Krall were finally doing what he wanted, grouping up, focusing their forces. That was good. It made what came next much easier. With slow, deliberate movements, he reached into his vest and pulled out a small, cylindrical device, a human distress beacon. Normally, this would signal for evac, but he had rewired it for something better. Something louder. He flicked the switch. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the device let out a high-pitched, ear-splitting wail. The Krall snapped to attention, mandibles clicking in alarm. It was the universal sound of something going horribly, horribly wrong. Carter lobbed the beacon into the middle of their camp and, for good measure, followed it up with a plasma grenade. The resulting explosion was less of a boom and more of a whump, the kind that sucked the air from your lungs and left only ringing silence in its wake. That was the cue. From the horizon, a streak of fire lit up the sky. Human reinforcements, finally responding to his earlier sabotage-induced mayhem. Drop pods slammed into the ground, and out poured fresh troops, rifles blazing. The Krall scrambled, their earlier bravado completely gone. They were warriors, sure, but they were used to overwhelming force, not desperate humans who fought like rabid wolverines on caffeine. Carter watched the chaos unfold with no small amount of satisfaction. Then he spotted Spiky Shoulders. The officer was trying to flee, mandibles clicking orders at his troops, orders no one was listening to anymore. Carter exhaled, rolled his shoulders, and started down the ridge. The first Krall on his path barely had time to react before he put a plasma bolt through its chest. The second lunged at him with a spear, but Carter ducked, twisted, and slammed the rifle stock into its head hard enough to crack its exoskeleton. Spiky Shoulders turned just in time to see Carter approaching. The officer chittered something, probably a curse, maybe a prayer, definitely not the confident mockery from before. Carter leveled his rifle. "Told you," he said, breath ragged but grin intact. "Should have finished the job." Spiky Shoulders lunged. Carter fired, but the Krall was faster than expected. The plasma bolt grazed its shoulder, but then it was on him, claws swinging. Carter barely dodged, pain flaring up his injured leg as he staggered back. The Krall's next strike knocked the rifle from his hands. It went skidding across the dirt, out of reach. Spiky Shoulders clicked something that sounded suspiciously like laughter. Carter sighed. "You guys really don't learn." The Krall lunged again, but this time, Carter was ready. He sidestepped, grabbed the officer's outstretched arm, and used its own momentum to slam it into the ground. Before it could recover, he yanked the plasma knife from his belt and buried it between its mandibles. The officer convulsed once, then went still. Carter exhaled, shoved the body aside, and flopped onto his back, staring at the sky. Around him, the battlefield was shifting. Human forces had pushed the Krall into full retreat. He could hear distant cheers, the crackle of radio chatter, the telltale thump of orbital bombardments sealing the deal. A shadow fell over him. He squinted up at a familiar face, Lieutenant Avery, one of the few people who tolerated his nonsense. "You look like hell," she said, offering a hand. Carter grinned as he took it. "You should see the other guys.